Welcome back, you guys. Today I'm going to show you how to make this epic tiered cherry layer cake. So it's summertime and cherries are definitely in season. I grew up in Washington where there are tons of cherry farms and it's one of my favorite fruits in the summer. So to make this cake, I'm using my favorite vanilla layer cake recipe and I'm filling it with a cherry buttercream. So this is just my classic American buttercream that I've added my favorite brand of cherry preserves to. So I really recommend using cherry preserves just because it's already reduced down and it has a really great flavor. And it's a great way to get that taste into your cake without throwing off the consistency of your buttercream. If you add fresh cherries, sometimes the juice can be too much and it can cause your buttercream to break. So as you guys can see, I filled my cake layers with that frosting, but I created a dam around it, and that's just because the cherry buttercream is a bit thinner than my classic buttercream, and the frosting dam is going to help keep everything in place as we apply our crumb coat and especially as we stack our layers. I began by building my larger bottom tier first, and these are 8-inch cake layers, and I made 3 of them using one batch of my layer cake recipe. I colored it a very light shade of yellow using a tiny bit of AmeriColor gel food coloring. And once all my layers were stacked, I frosted them and applied a very thin crumb coat. And I then popped this into the freezer to allow it to firm up while I worked on my second top tier. Since my bottom tier is 8 inches, I wanted to leave enough space between the 2 tiers to create kind of a shelf for all of my cherries. So these are 6-inch cake layers, and I used a half a batch of my layer cake recipe to create these 3 layers. I also made kind of an ombre effect with my layers, and I colored the bottom tier a bit darker of a shade of yellow and then faded that as I went up. So once my 3 layers were stacked using the same technique as I used for my bottom tier and the same filling, I applied a crumb coat to this and smoothed it out before swapping this layer out with my bottom tier. Once my bottom tier was nice and chilled, I added a second thicker layer of frosting using my same American buttercream. So for this you can see I'm using quite a bit of frosting, but you really want to have a decent amount on here to make sure that you get a really nice smooth finish. There are a few tips and tricks that I have to get really smooth sides on my cakes, and if you want to see a full tutorial on exactly how I frost my cakes, you can click the link in the upper right corner. Once I had smoothed out both of my tiers, it was time to support my cake. So I sometimes use wooden dowels, but I've really been enjoying using some thick bubble tea straws lately. They're super easy to trim, they really provide great support, and I think they're so much easier to work with than wooden dowels. So I took 4 of these thick straws that are plastic, and I made sure they were exactly the height of my cake, and then I carefully inserted them into my cake. I like to mark out where I'm going to place them before I insert them into the cake. It just makes me feel a little bit better as I push them in. So my cake was chilled, so I did have to push pretty hard to get these into the cake. But just be careful as you do this because you don't want to slip and have your fingers kind of jab into your cake. Once all of my straws were in place, I pressed down lightly on top of them one more time just to make sure that they were really flush against the top of my cake. Next, it came time for the really fun part, which is painting some streaks around the base of this cake. So I really wanted the colors to emulate the beautiful shades that are on Rainier cherries. So I started off with a kind of light shade of yellow. And for this, I used some yellow AmeriColor gel food coloring that I mixed with a little bit of vodka. So I brushed this around the cake, kind of just doing some light brush strokes, not applying a lot of pressure. And then I added in some red gel streaks as well. So when I first started this, I was pretty timid just because that red is so bright, and I was just getting a tiny bit of paint on my paintbrush. But as I went along, I got a bit more confident, and I felt more comfortable making my streaks a bit more defined. And I really, at the end of the day, just wanted these to blend together to look like a beautiful Rainier cherry. So I didn't mind that they kind of overlapped a little bit and kind of started blending together. I repeated this process on my bottom tier all the way around because I want them to match. I'll be placing Rainier cherries around the base of the cake as well as around the base of the top tiers, so I want them to have similar vibes. So with this bottom tier I had a bit more fun because I was more comfortable with the process since I had already essentially practiced on my top tier. And once I'd blended all the colors together to look similar to my top tier, it came time for the really fun part to stack my tiers. So to do this, I like to use my offset spatulas to really carefully lift my top tier. and place it into the center of my cake. So normally if you're transporting a cake or if you're making a cake that has more tiers than this, you would use a center dowel to make sure that all of your tiers are nice and stable. But since this cake is just staying in my apartment today and this is really just a cake for fun, I did not use a center dowel. So the cake will be supported by those bubble tea straws, and I've covered my cake board using a little bit more buttercream. So once I smoothed out that additional frosting, it was time to add on those beautiful Rainier cherries. So I got these at Whole Foods and they were on sale, which was great. And I just love the color of them. You can see that they have those beautiful blends of yellow and red. And I placed them around my entire base of my cake as well as on top of my bottom tier. I ended up snacking on quite a few cherries while I was making this cake, and I used about 1.5 bags of cherries. So I loved the way that looked, but I also wanted to add a couple cherries to the top, and I ended up deciding that I thought that 5 would be just the magic number. So I placed 4 on top and then 1 magical cherry right on top. And that is it. I feel like I should have made some kind of cherry on top joke there, but I think I'm past that point now. So we'll cut in so you guys can see the ombre layers that we made on that top tier and also that really delicious cherry buttercream. So I removed the cherries from the side as I pulled this out just so they didn't spill everywhere. But you can see our cherry buttercream with bits of real cherries and our ombre cake layers. So thanks so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to click the like button, and if you don't already, be sure to subscribe. And also don't forget to let me know what tutorials you'd like to see next.